It was not merely an artistic movement or a fleeting cultural trend. Modernism represented a complete philosophical rupture with the assumptions that had governed Western civilization for centuries. It was, in essence, a crisis of meaning that forced intellectuals, artists and thinkers to confront an uncomfortable truth. The old certainties were dead, and nothing secure had risen to replace them. Modernism emerged as both a response to and a product of massive historical transformations, including industrialization, urbanization, secularization, and the devastation of World War I. The movement encompassed literature, visual arts, music, architecture, and philosophy, but what unified these diverse expressions was a shared conviction that traditional forms could no longer adequately represent or respond to modern experience. Modernists made formal experimentation and non-traditional subjects essential to the new age, seeking to capture the contradictions, horrors, and possibilities of modernity. What makes modernism intellectually profound is not its rebellion for rebellion's sake, but rather its serious philosophical engagement with questions that had become unavoidable. If God is dead, as Nietzsche proclaimed, then where does meaning come from? If Freud is correct that our conscious minds are merely the tip of a vast unconscious iceberg, then what does it mean to be rational? If time is not objective and linear, but subjective and fluid, as Bergson argued, then how do we construct narratives about our lives? These were not abstract academic questions. They were existential crises that demanded new modes of thinking and expression. The movement was fundamentally characterized by several interconnected ideas. First, it took a critical stance toward Enlightenment rationalism, questioning whether reason alone could provide access to truth or guide human flourishing. Second, it rejected the 19th century concepts of absolute originality and realism, instead embracing techniques of collage, fragmentation, and self-referential art that highlighted its own constructed nature. Third, it placed enormous emphasis on subjective experience and individual perception over claims to objective reality. Fourth, it was driven by what can only be described as a mania for the new, a compulsive need to break with tradition and discover unprecedented forms of expression. Yet, crucially, modernism also rejected the romantic notion of creation from nothing, instead working through incorporation, revision, and parody of existing forms. This paradox sits at the heart of modernism. It was simultaneously iconoclastic and deeply aware of tradition, revolutionary yet dependent on what it sought to destroy. This video will examine modernism not as a collection of artworks or literary techniques, but as a comprehensive philosophical worldview. We will explore its intellectual foundations, trace how these ideas manifested in practice, analyze the fierce debates it provoked, confront where it failed, and assess its lasting impact on how we think today. This is not a celebration of modernism, nor a wholesale condemnation. It is an attempt to understand, with intellectual rigor and clear reasoning, what modernism actually was and what it means for us now. Part 1. The Philosophical Demolition. To understand modernism, we must begin where it began, with the systematic demolition of the philosophical assumptions that had structured Western thought since the Enlightenment. This was not mere academic debate. It was an intellectual earthquake that shook the foundations of how people understood truth, morality, consciousness, and reality itself. Three thinkers stand as the primary architects of this demolition: Friedrich Nietzsche, Sigmund Freud, and Henri Bergson. Their ideas did not simply influence modernist artists. They made modernism possible by destroying the old framework and revealing the void beneath. Friedrich Nietzsche's work served as a major precursor to modernism, with his philosophy centered on psychological drives and specifically the will to power. But what does this actually mean, stripped of mystification? The will to power describes what Nietzsche believed to be the main driving force in humans, though he never systematically defined it, leaving interpretation open to debate. At its core, the will to power is the fundamental drive of all living things, not merely to survive, but to expand, to grow, to impose their strength on the world around them. This is not about political domination, though it can manifest there. It is about the basic impulse of life itself to overflow its current boundaries. Nietzsche thought that the will to power and struggle were more fundamental than a will to survive or mere self-preservation. This inverted everything. For centuries, Western philosophy had assumed that human beings were fundamentally rational creatures seeking happiness, security, or salvation. Nietzsche said no. We are fundamentally drives and forces seeking to actualize our power. Reason is not the master of the house. It is a tool that these deeper drives employ to achieve their ends. The implications were staggering. Nietzsche's criticisms relied on psychological diagnoses that exposed false consciousness infecting people's received ideas, which is why he is associated with advancing a hermeneutics of suspicion against traditional values. What this means concretely is that Nietzsche taught people to distrust their own conscious motivations. When someone claims to act morally, Nietzsche asks, what unconscious resentment or will to power is actually driving this? When a culture celebrates certain values as universal truths, Nietzsche asks, whose power does this serve? His most explosive idea was the death of God. This was not a celebration. Nietzsche understood that the death of God meant the collapse of the entire moral and metaphysical structure of Western civilization. His provocative ideas, including the death of God and the Übermensch, were revolutionary for modernism because he rejected absolute truths and gave modernists a philosophical foundation for embracing creativity and questioning norms. If there is no God, then there are no objective moral truths written into the fabric of reality. Values are human creations, expressions of will to power, nothing more. This created a crisis. Either humans would sink into nihilism and despair, or they would have to become creators of their own values. Nietzsche challenged traditional morals and encouraged a life defined by individual purpose. The Übermensch, or Overman, was his response to nihilism, a figure who could live without the crutch of external validation or transcendent meaning, who could create values rather than merely inherit them. This idea profoundly shaped modernist thinking about the role of the artist. The artist became, in modernist imagination, a kind of Übermensch who creates meaning through aesthetic innovation in a world stripped of inherent purpose. Nietzsche consistently critiqued the Western conception of the rational subject which portrays reason or mind as a higher faculty governing the body, instead affirming a materialist perspective that took seriously human needs and drives. This demolition of the rational subject was crucial for modernism. If human beings are not fundamentally rational, if consciousness is just the surface of deeper drives, then the whole Enlightenment project of using reason to achieve progress becomes questionable. Modernist literature would obsessively explore this fractured subject, showing characters driven by forces they do not understand, consciousness fragmented and unstable. The second great demolisher was Sigmund Freud. Central to Freud's thinking is the idea of the primacy of the unconscious mind in mental life, so that all subjective reality was based on interactions between basic drives and instincts through which the outside world was perceived. Think about what this means. When you believe you are thinking rationally, making free choices, understanding reality clearly, Freud says you are actually responding to unconscious drives, repressed memories, and mechanisms of defense that operate completely outside your awareness. Your conscious mind is not the author of your thoughts. It is their interpreter, and often a poor one. Freud's description of subjective states involved an unconscious mind full of primal impulses and counterbalancing self-imposed restrictions derived from social values. Human consciousness in this view is a battleground. On one side are primitive drives seeking immediate gratification. On the other side are internalized social rules and moral commands. What we experience as our conscious self is the compromise formation between these warring forces. We are not unified subjects. We are fractured, conflicted, driven by desires we cannot acknowledge. Freud's psychoanalysis revealed the unconscious mind's influence over thoughts, dreams, and desires. This revelation transformed how modernist artists approached representation. If much of human motivation is unconscious, then realistic depictions of conscious thought miss the deeper truth. Modernist techniques like stream of consciousness, fragmentation, and dream logic were attempts to represent this newly discovered psychic reality. The chaotic, associative flow of Mrs. Dalloway's thoughts in Virginia Woolf's novel is not just an artistic experiment. It is an attempt to show consciousness as Freud revealed it to be, not orderly and rational, but fluid, associative, driven by forces below the surface. Henri Bergson, on the other hand, emphasized the difference between scientific clock time and the direct subjective human experience of time. This might seem like an obscure philosophical point, but it had revolutionary implications. Scientific time, the time measured by clocks, is uniform and objective. Each second is identical to every other second. But our lived experience of time is nothing like this. Sometimes an hour flies by in what feels like minutes. Sometimes 5 minutes of anxiety feels like an eternity. Which time is real? Bergson's notion of duration, a concept of time as subjective and fluid, opposed deterministic views of time as linear and fixed. For Bergson, real time is duration, the continuous flow of lived experience that cannot be divided into discrete moments. When we try to measure time scientifically, we spatialize it, we freeze it into measurable units. But this destroys what time actually is in our experience. A flowing, interpenetrating continuity where past and present are not separate, but merge into each other through memory. Bergson's work on time and consciousness had a great influence on 20th century novelists, especially modernists who used the stream of consciousness technique. Writers like James Joyce and Virginia Woolf were not simply being difficult or experimental for its own sake. They were trying to represent consciousness as it actually operates in Bergsonian time, where memories intrude into present perceptions, where the boundary between now and then dissolves. The famous final section of Joyce's Ulysses, Molly Bloom's unpunctuated interior monologue, is an attempt to capture this duration, this flow of consciousness in lived time rather than clock time. Bergson's philosophy also featured the idea of élan vital, the life force that brings about the creative evolution of everything, and he placed high value on intuition without rejecting the importance of intellect. This concept gave modernists a philosophical justification for privileging intuition, instinct, and creative impulse over rational analysis. If there is a vital force driving evolution and creativity, then perhaps the artist who follows intuition is accessing something deeper than rational planning could achieve. This was not anti-intellectualism. It was a repositioning of the relationship between different modes of knowing, giving intuitive and emotional knowledge equal or superior status to rational analysis. At its core, modernist philosophy is characterized by a rejection of traditional notions of truth and reality, an emphasis on subjective experience and individual perspective, and a critique of Enlightenment values and rationality. But we must be precise about what this rejection entailed. Modernists were not saying there is no truth whatsoever. They were saying that truth is not a simple correspondence between our ideas and an objective external reality. Truth is perspectival, constructed, dependent on the standpoint from which one views. This does not make it arbitrary or meaningless, but it does make it plural and contested. Modernist thinkers argued that traditional notions of truth and reality are based on outdated metaphysical and epistemological assumptions that no longer hold. The Enlightenment had assumed that through reason and scientific method, we could progressively uncover objective truths about reality and use these truths to improve human life. But the late 19th and early 20th centuries revealed the limitations of this faith. Science had produced not just progress, but also weapons of mass destruction. Reason had produced not just enlightenment, but also efficient systems of oppression. Industrialization had created wealth, but also alienation and exploitation. The Enlightenment project was not delivering on its promises. Modernist philosophy placed strong emphasis on subjective experience and individual perspective, arguing that individual experience and perception are the primary sources of knowledge and understanding. This was not solipsism. It was a recognition that we cannot step outside our own perspective to access some view from nowhere. All knowledge is knowledge from somewhere, filtered through particular minds with particular histories. The question then becomes not how to eliminate perspective and achieve objectivity, but how to acknowledge and work with the inescapable perspectival nature of human knowledge. Modernist philosophy was characterized by a critique of Enlightenment values and rationality, arguing that the Enlightenment's emphasis on reason and rationality led to neglect of other important aspects of human experience like emotion, intuition, and creativity. This was perhaps the most fundamental break. The Enlightenment had believed that reason, properly applied, was the solution to human problems. Modernism said that reason itself might be part of the problem. Not that reason is useless or should be abandoned, but that its hegemony over other ways of knowing had created an impoverished and potentially dangerous form of life. Instrumental rationality, the calculating reason that figures out efficient means to ends, had triumphed. But it could not answer the question of which ends are worth pursuing. It could tell you how to build an atomic bomb with ruthless efficiency, but it could not tell you whether you should. These three thinkers, Nietzsche, Freud, and Bergson, did not work in isolation. They were part of a broader cultural crisis where old certainties were collapsing, but they gave that crisis philosophical articulation. They provided the concepts and frameworks that allowed modernist artists to make sense of their own experiences of fragmentation, alienation, and the inadequacy of traditional forms. The will to power, the unconscious duration. These were not just abstract ideas. They were tools for understanding a world that had become incomprehensible through traditional lenses. The demolition these thinkers carried out was thorough. The rational subject, the objective world, universal moral truths, linear time, the primacy of consciousness, all of these foundational assumptions were called into question or rejected outright. This created enormous anxiety. While modernism regarded fragmentation as tragic and lamented the loss of unity, hoping to regain it through art, postmodernism would later celebrate fragmentation. Modernists were not happy about the collapse of certainty. They experienced it as loss, as tragedy. Their art was often an attempt to create new forms of unity and meaning in the absence of the old guarantees. But the demolition also created tremendous intellectual and creative freedom. If there are no fixed rules, if reality is not given but constructed, if consciousness is not a unified rational subject but a flowing multiplicity, then entirely new forms of art and thought become possible. The price of this freedom was high: uncertainty, anxiety, the constant risk of nihilism. But modernism chose to pay that price rather than cling to comforting illusions. This philosophical courage, this willingness to confront uncomfortable truths about reality and consciousness, is what gives modernism its intellectual power and its lasting relevance. Part 2. The Modernist Worldview. Now that we understand the philosophical demolition that made modernism possible, we must examine what modernists actually believed and how they approached the world. This is not a unified doctrine. Modernism was never a single coherent movement with a manifesto that everyone followed. It was instead a constellation of responses to the same underlying crisis, responses that sometimes contradicted each other while sharing fundamental assumptions. What unified modernists was not agreement on solutions, but recognition of the same problems. The first and most essential characteristic of the modernist worldview was the sense of a decisive break with tradition. This was not simply generational rebellion or aesthetic preference. Modernists genuinely believed that something fundamental had changed in the nature of human experience, something so profound that the old ways of representing reality had become obsolete. The forms of art and thought that had served humanity for centuries were now inadequate. This conviction was not arbitrary. It arose from concrete historical conditions. Consider what had happened in the span of a single generation. Entire populations had moved from rural agricultural life to urban industrial existence. The pace of technological change had accelerated beyond anything previously imaginable. Railways, telegraphs, electricity, photography, cinema, automobiles, airplanes, each of these inventions fundamentally altered human perception and experience. Time and space themselves seemed to have been conquered, or at least radically compressed. You could communicate instantly across continents. You could travel distances in hours that once took weeks. The world had become simultaneously larger through global interconnection and smaller through the annihilation of distance. Then came World War I, and with it the complete destruction of any remaining faith in progress or rationality. The war revealed that all the technological and scientific advancement of the previous century could be mobilized not for human flourishing, but for industrial-scale slaughter. Millions died in trenches, killed by machine guns, poison gas, artillery barrages coordinated by telegraph and telephone. The war demonstrated with horrifying clarity that instrumental reason, the ability to efficiently achieve given ends, was perfectly compatible with barbarism. Indeed, it made barbarism more efficient. Modernism emerged from this context as both a diagnosis and a response. The diagnosis was that traditional forms of representation, based on stable reality and unified consciousness, could not capture the fragmented, accelerated, disorienting nature of modern experience. The 19th-century realist novel, with its omniscient narrator and orderly plot leading to moral resolution, seemed quaint and false. It assumed a world where cause and effect were clear, where characters had coherent motivations, where reality could be objectively described. But if Freud was right about the unconscious, if Nietzsche was right about the death of God, if Bergson was right about duration, then this whole mode of representation was built on false premises. The modernist response was formal experimentation. This phrase sounds academic and abstract, but what it meant in practice was radical. Modernists did not experiment for the sake of novelty or to shock the bourgeoisie, though those effects certainly occurred. They experimented because they genuinely believed that new forms were necessary to represent new realities. If consciousness is not orderly but fragmentary, then narrative should be fragmentary. If time is not linear but interpenetrating, then chronology should be disrupted. If the self is not unified but multiple, then character should be unstable and contradictory. This is why modernist art can seem difficult or obscure. It is not trying to be difficult. It is trying to be truthful to a more complex and disturbing vision of reality than conventional forms can accommodate. When James Joyce abandons punctuation and conventional syntax in the final pages of Ulysses, he is not showing off. He is attempting to represent consciousness in its actual flowing movement before it has been tidied up and rationalized. When Pablo Picasso shows multiple perspectives of a face simultaneously in a Cubist painting, he is not being perverse. He is rejecting the fiction that there is a single correct viewpoint from which reality should be represented. Modernism thus embraced what can be called reflexivity, meaning a self-conscious awareness of artistic and social conventions and an inclination to expose how works of art are constructed. This was a radical departure. Traditional art tried to conceal its artificiality, to create the illusion that you were looking through a transparent window onto reality. Modernist art deliberately broke this illusion. It made you aware that you were looking at a painting, reading a text, experiencing a constructed artifact. The point was not to destroy art, but to be honest about what art is. Not a mirror of reality, but a human construction that shapes reality in particular ways. This reflexivity extended to language itself. Modernists became deeply suspicious of language, doubting its ability to transparently convey meaning. Words, they recognized, do not have fixed, stable meanings that correspond to things in the world. Meanings shift depending on context, speaker, listener, historical moment. Language is not a neutral tool for describing reality. It actively shapes how we think and what we can perceive. This insight, which would be developed more fully in later philosophy, was already operative in modernist practice. Consider what this meant for writers. If you cannot trust language to mean what it says, if words are slippery and unreliable, then writing becomes a much more anxious and self-conscious activity. You cannot simply use words as transparent vehicles for ideas. You must wrestle with the materiality of language itself, with its sounds and rhythms and associations. This is why modernist poetry often seems more concerned with the texture of language than with clear communication of ideas. Poets like T.S. Eliot and Ezra Pound were not being obscure for the sake of obscurity. They were grappling with the fundamental instability of linguistic meaning. Another core element of the modernist worldview was the emphasis on perception and experience over objective reality. This was not idealism in the philosophical sense, not a denial that external reality exists. It was rather a recognition that we never have direct access to reality as it is in itself. All we ever have is our perceptions, filtered through our particular sensory apparatus, shaped by our concepts and expectations, coloured by our emotions and memories. The question is not whether reality exists, but whether we can meaningfully talk about reality independent of how it appears to consciousness. This led modernists to focus intensely on the nature of perception itself. How do we actually see, hear, feel, experience the world? Not how do textbooks say we should experience it, but how does it actually happen in the moment? This focus produced remarkable innovations. Writers began to notice and represent aspects of consciousness that had been invisible to previous art. The way attention wanders, the intrusion of unbidden memories, the simultaneous experience of multiple time frames, the gap between what we perceive and what we can articulate. Virginia Woolf's work exemplifies this concern. Her novels are not primarily about external events or social conflicts. They are about the texture of consciousness, the way moments of perception contain entire worlds of meaning and association. When Mrs. Ramsay in To the Lighthouse looks at her husband or perceives the lighthouse beam, these are not just simple observations. They are dense nodes of meaning, memory, emotion, and thought that unfold in Woolf's prose with extraordinary subtlety. The plot, in the conventional sense, becomes almost irrelevant. What matters is the quality of awareness itself. This emphasis on subjective experience created a profound tension within modernism. On one hand, it led to a kind of radical individualism. If each person's experience is unique and perspectival, if there is no objective view from nowhere, then we are each locked in our own subjective worlds to some degree. Communication becomes problematic, shared meaning uncertain. This is the spectre of solipsism that haunted modernism. The fear that we are each trapped in private worlds with no genuine access to other minds. On the other hand, modernism never fully embraced solipsism. Most modernist artists believed, or at least hoped, that by representing subjective experience with sufficient precision and honesty, they could create forms of recognition across individual differences. If I can show you what consciousness really feels like from the inside, perhaps you will recognize in my representation something of your own experience. Art becomes a bridge across subjective isolation, not by denying subjectivity, but by rendering it so precisely that it becomes communicable. This brings us to another crucial aspect of the modernist worldview: the privileged role assigned to the artist. In a world without God, without objective moral truths, without secure foundations for knowledge, what remains? Modernists answered, human creativity. The artist became a kind of secular priest or prophet, someone who could create meaning and order in a world that no longer provided these things naturally. This was an enormous burden and an enormous arrogance. The arrogance lay in the assumption that artists had special access to truth or special abilities to perceive reality more clearly than ordinary people. This led to a pronounced elitism in modernist culture. Modernist works were often deliberately difficult, requiring specialized knowledge and cultural capital to understand. This was partly necessary given what they were trying to do, but it was also partly a way of distinguishing the cultured elite from the masses. There was often contempt for popular culture, for mass entertainment, for anything that catered to common taste. This elitism had political dimensions that we will explore later, but for now we need to understand it as part of the modernist worldview. Modernists genuinely believed that high culture was better than low culture, not just different, but qualitatively superior. They believed that most people lived in a kind of sleepwalking state, accepting conventional ideas uncritically, experiencing the world in superficial and deadened ways. The artist's task was to wake people up, to make them see and feel more intensely and authentically. There was also a pronounced pessimism in the modernist worldview, though it coexisted with moments of exhilaration about creative possibility. The pessimism came from the recognition that the old sources of meaning were gone and might not be replaced. Modernists lived in what Max Weber called the disenchantment of the world. Magic, myth, religion, all the ways that humans had previously made sense of existence had been exposed as illusions, or at least as subjective projections rather than objective truths. What remained was a world of pure fact, measurable and manipulable, but ultimately meaningless. Many modernists experienced this disenchantment as a profound loss. Eliot's poem, The Waste Land, is perhaps the most famous expression of this sensibility. The poem depicts a spiritually dead civilization where meaningful ritual and belief have been replaced by empty routine and sterile sexuality. References to myth and religion abound, but only as fragments, broken pieces of traditions that can no longer sustain living faith. The poem does not offer solutions. It diagnoses a condition of spiritual crisis. Yet alongside this pessimism was a countervailing impulse toward what we might call aesthetic salvation. If religion could no longer provide transcendence, if philosophy could no longer provide certainty, perhaps art could provide its own form of meaning. This was not a simple or naive belief. Modernists knew that art is human construction, that aesthetic order is imposed rather than discovered. But perhaps that was enough. Perhaps in the act of creating form out of chaos, of making something beautiful or powerful or true in its own terms, human beings could find purpose and meaning. This is why craft mattered so much to modernists. The intense focus on technique, on getting the words or images or sounds exactly right, was not mere perfectionism. It was a way of asserting human dignity and capability in a universe that no longer guaranteed either. If we can make something excellent, something that achieves what it sets out to achieve with precision and power, then we have created value even in a world without inherent values. The modernist worldview also included a complex relationship to tradition. On the surface, modernism defined itself through rejection of the past. The Italian futurists wanted to burn down museums and libraries. Ezra Pound commanded writers to make it new. The rhetoric was revolutionary, oriented toward rupture and innovation. But in practice, modernists were deeply engaged with tradition, constantly alluding to and reworking classical and medieval texts, myths and forms. This was not contradiction, but paradox. Modernists rejected the immediate past. The 19th century conventions they found stifling. But they often reached back to more distant pasts, to classical antiquity or Renaissance Europe or non-Western traditions, finding in these sources alternative models and forms. Eliot's poetry is saturated with references to Dante, Shakespeare, the Hindu Upanishads, Buddhist philosophy. James Joyce's Ulysses is structured as a modernization of Homer's Odyssey. These were not simple borrowings, but complex dialogues with tradition. The point was that modernists refused to accept tradition as a given that must be passively inherited. Instead, they actively selected and reworked elements from various traditions, creating new synthetic forms. This is what Eliot meant by his influential idea of the tradition and the individual talent. The relationship between past and present is not one-directional. Each new work of genuine innovation changes how we understand the past, revealing new possibilities in older works. Finally, the modernist worldview was characterized by a particular understanding of truth. This was not relativism in the sense of believing that all perspectives are equally valid, or that anything goes. Most modernists believed in truth and excellence. They made strong judgments about what was good and bad, authentic and false. But their conception of truth was complex and non-foundational. Truth was not correspondence to external reality. It was something like coherence, power, the ability to illuminate experience in ways that feel right, even if they cannot be proven. This is why modernism could be simultaneously skeptical about traditional truth claims and deeply committed to artistic integrity. The commitment was not to matching some external standard, but to fidelity to one's own perception and vision. The worst sin for a modernist artist was not being wrong in some factual sense, but being false to one's own experience, writing what you think you should write, rather than what you actually see and feel. Authenticity became the criterion of value in the absence of more objective standards. This emphasis on authenticity created its own problems, which we will explore in later sections. It could lead to self-indulgence, to the elevation of merely personal neurosis to the status of profound insight. It could make criticism difficult, since any negative judgment could be dismissed as failing to understand the artist's unique vision. It could fragment artistic practice into mutually incomprehensible private languages. But it also produced works of extraordinary honesty and power, works that cut through conventional pieties to expose uncomfortable truths about consciousness and experience. The modernist worldview, then, was characterized by a sense of rupture with the past, a commitment to formal experimentation as necessary rather than optional, a focus on subjective perception and experience, a privileged role for the artist as creator of meaning, a tension between pessimism about modernity and faith in aesthetic possibility, a complex relationship to tradition involving both rejection and selective appropriation, and a conception of truth centered on authenticity and fidelity to experience rather than correspondence to objective reality. These elements did not form a systematic philosophy. They were rather a set of overlapping commitments and concerns that gave modernism its distinctive character and its enduring power. Part 3. Consciousness Reimagined. Perhaps nowhere is the modernist revolution more evident than in its radical reconceptualization of human consciousness. This was not simply a matter of literary technique or aesthetic preference. It represented a fundamental challenge to how Western culture had understood the human mind for centuries. The traditional view, inherited from Descartes and enshrined in Enlightenment thought, held that consciousness is essentially rational, unified, and transparent to itself. The conscious subject knows what it thinks and why. It can introspect and accurately report its mental states. It experiences itself as a coherent entity, persisting through time. Modernism shattered this picture. Drawing on the philosophical and psychological insights we explored in Part 1, modernist artists developed new techniques for representing consciousness as it actually operates rather than as philosophy had imagined it. What they discovered was that consciousness is not orderly, unified, or fully self-aware. It is fragmentary, associative, layered, and largely opaque to itself. Much of what drives our thoughts and actions occurs below the threshold of awareness. Memory intrudes unbidden. Attention wanders. Multiple thoughts occur simultaneously. The boundaries between perceiving, remembering, and imagining blur. The most famous technique modernists developed to represent this new understanding of consciousness was stream of consciousness. This term is somewhat misleading because it suggests a smooth flow, when in fact the technique often represents choppy, interrupted, multidirectional mental processes. But the core idea was to render the actual texture of thought as it happens in the moment, before it has been cleaned up and rationalized for public consumption. Stream of consciousness appears in its most radical form in the work of James Joyce. In the final episode of Ulysses, Molly Bloom's interior monologue runs for approximately 40 pages without punctuation, capturing the drowsy associative flow of consciousness on the edge of sleep. Thoughts about her husband blend seamlessly into memories of past lovers, observations about her body, fragments of songs, sexual fantasies, mundane worries about money. There is no hierarchy of importance. The profound and the trivial exist side by side because that is how consciousness actually works. What Joyce understood is that consciousness does not organize itself according to logical principles or narrative coherence. It follows paths of association. One thought triggers another, not because of logical connection, but because of emotional resonance, sensory similarity, temporal contiguity, or unconscious significance. A memory surfaces not because it is relevant to the current situation, but because some stimulus, perhaps not even consciously registered, has activated it. This is why stream of consciousness can seem chaotic or difficult to follow. It is representing a different kind of order, the order of psychological association rather than logical argument. Virginia Woolf approached stream of consciousness differently but with similar insight. Her technique was generally more controlled than Joyce's, maintaining grammatical structure while capturing the fluid movement of awareness. In Mrs. Dalloway, consciousness flows from character to character, showing how a single moment of experience contains multiple layers of meaning. When Clarissa Dalloway walks through London buying flowers for her party, this simple action becomes the occasion for memories of her youth, reflections on her choices, awareness of mortality, perceptions of the city, and interactions with others. Past and present interpenetrate continuously. What Woolf captured with extraordinary precision was the way consciousness moves between different temporal frames. You are never simply in the present moment. You are always also in various pasts, through memory and various futures, through anticipation and anxiety. The present moment is thick with temporal layers. This was Bergson's insight translated into literary form. Duration, the interpenetration of past and present in lived experience, as opposed to the artificial separation of moments in clock time. The stream of consciousness technique also made visible what had been largely invisible in previous literature: the gap between public persona and private consciousness. All of us maintain a socially acceptable exterior while internally experiencing thoughts and feelings we would never express. Traditional literature had represented this gap occasionally, but modernist stream of consciousness made it central. You could now see the vast difference between what a character says and does and what they actually think and feel. This created a new kind of psychological realism that was paradoxically achieved through techniques that seemed to violate conventional realism. By abandoning neat chronology, clear causal chains, and orderly exposition, modernists achieved a more truthful representation of subjective experience. The chaos and fragmentation were not aesthetic choices imposed on orderly material. They were inherent in the material itself, in the actual structure of consciousness. Another key aspect of modernist treatment of consciousness was the representation of perception itself. Modernists became fascinated with how we actually perceive the world, not how we remember perceiving it after the fact. There is a difference. In retrospect, perception seems orderly. We saw this, then that, and we understood what we were seeing. But in the moment of perception, before interpretation has solidified, experience is more fluid and ambiguous. This is what Impressionist painters had discovered. If you want to represent not the object as it is known to be, but the object as it is immediately perceived, you must abandon clear outlines and definite forms. Light, colour and atmosphere become more important than solid shapes. Similarly, modernist writers began to represent moments of perception before they had been translated into clear concepts. Dorothy Richardson pioneered this in her novel Sequence Pilgrimage, attempting to render pure perceptual experience from a female protagonist's perspective. The result was a new attentiveness to the sensory texture of experience. Colours, sounds, smells, tactile sensations, these became foregrounded in ways they had not been in previous literature. Not as mere decoration or atmosphere setting, but as fundamental components of consciousness. We are embodied creatures, and much of our experience consists of sensory awareness that never gets fully articulated in language. Modernists tried to capture this non-linguistic dimension of consciousness, the felt quality of experience that exceeds or precedes verbal formulation. This attention to perception also revealed the constructive nature of consciousness. We do not passively receive sense data and then interpret them. Perception is already interpretive from the beginning. We see what we expect to see, what our concepts prepare us to recognize. When this normal process breaks down, when familiar objects become strange, or when sensory input overwhelms our categories, the normally invisible process of perceptual construction becomes visible. Modernist fiction often depicts such moments of perceptual breakdown or transformation. A character sees something familiar suddenly appear alien. Colours become intensely vivid. Objects lose their names and become pure presence. These are not mystical experiences necessarily, though modernism had a complex relationship with mysticism. They are rather moments when the normal automatism of perception is disrupted and we become aware of seeing itself. The fragmentation of consciousness was another major modernist theme. The idea that consciousness is fundamentally unified, that there is a single coherent self that remains constant through changing experiences, came under intense scrutiny. Modernists found this idea increasingly implausible. We contain multitudes, as Walt Whitman had proclaimed. We are different selves in different contexts. We contradict ourselves. Memory is selective and reconstructive, so the past self we remember is partly a fiction. What then is the self that supposedly unifies all these fragments? This question became central to modernist literature. Characters are not stable personalities with consistent traits. They are processes, constantly in flux, subject to internal contradictions and unexpected transformations. Marcel Proust's multi-volume novel In Search of Lost Time explores this problem with unsurpassed depth. The narrator discovers that he is not the same person from moment to moment, that memory radically reconstructs the past, that the self is not a substance, but a series of discontinuous states, loosely linked by a name and a body. The political and ethical implications of this fragmented self were troubling. If there is no stable self, then who is responsible for past actions? How can we make commitments that extend into the future when we do not know what self we will become? Modernism did not resolve these questions. It made them visible and urgent. Another dimension of modernist treatment of consciousness was the representation of interior time as distinct from calendar or clock time. We have already discussed Bergson's concept of duration, but we need to see how this manifested in practice. In conventional narrative, time moves forward in a linear sequence. Events happen in order, and this order is usually the order of telling. Even when there are flashbacks, they are clearly marked as departures from the main chronology. Modernist narrative disrupted this linearity. In works like William Faulkner's The Sound and the Fury, chronology is scrambled. The first section is narrated by a mentally disabled character who experiences time as an eternal present, where past and present are indistinguishable. The effect is initially disorienting, but it serves a purpose. It shows that clock time, the time of calendars and schedules, is not the only temporality. There are other modes of temporal experience that are equally real, perhaps more real in terms of lived significance. Memory became a crucial site for exploring interior time. Memory does not work like a filing cabinet where past experiences are stored in chronological order and can be retrieved intact. Memory is reconstructive and highly selective. We remember what has emotional significance, not what actually happened in full detail. We unconsciously edit memories to make them coherent with our current self-understanding. Modernist literature made these processes visible. Proust's work is again exemplary. The famous Madeleine episode in the first volume shows how involuntary memory, triggered by a sensory experience, can recover the past more vividly than deliberate recollection. The taste of the tea-soaked cake suddenly opens up the narrator's entire childhood world, not as a series of facts, but as a living presence. This is duration. The past not as dead and gone, but as continuing to exist within the present moment, accessible through the right trigger. The representation of dreams and dreamlike states was another modernist concern. Freud had argued that dreams were the royal road to the unconscious, and modernists took this seriously. But they did not simply insert dream sequences into otherwise realistic narratives. Instead, they began to blur the boundary between waking and dreaming consciousness, suggesting that ordinary thought has more in common with dreams than we usually acknowledge. Both dreams and waking thought work through association, condensation, displacement, and symbolic representation. The difference is degree rather than kind. This insight led to techniques that move freely between realistic description and surreal imagery, between external events and internal fantasy. The reader is sometimes uncertain whether something is actually happening or only being imagined by a character, and this uncertainty is intentional. It reflects the actual ambiguity of much of our mental life, where we are not always sure whether we are perceiving, remembering, or fantasizing. The modernist treatment of consciousness also involved representing multiple consciousness simultaneously. This was particularly challenging because language is linear. You can only say one thing at a time. But consciousness, especially the consciousness of different people in the same space, is simultaneous. Multiple minds are registering the same events from different perspectives. How do you represent this in prose? Woolf's solution in Mrs. Dalloway was to move fluidly between different characters' perspectives within a single scene, showing how the same moment appears differently to different consciousnesses. A gesture that seems meaningless to one character is laden with significance for another. An event that dominates one person's awareness barely registers for someone else. This technique created a kind of prismatic effect, where reality is refracted through multiple subjective lenses, with no single objective view privileged as the truth. All of these innovations in representing consciousness had philosophical implications. They constituted an implicit argument about the nature of mind and reality. Against the Cartesian view of consciousness as transparent and unified, modernism offered a view of consciousness as opaque, fragmented, and processual. Against the empiricist idea that we have direct access to an objective external world, modernism emphasized the mediating role of perspective, memory, and interpretation. Against the notion of a stable self persisting through time, modernism presented the self as a flux of changing states loosely unified by memory and habit. These were not merely theoretical positions. They emerged from serious attempts to capture experience as it is actually lived. The test was phenomenological. Does this representation ring true to your own experience of consciousness when you attend to it carefully? Many readers found that it did, that modernist techniques revealed aspects of their mental life that they had experienced but never seen represented in literature. But there were also dangers and limitations in this approach. The intense focus on individual consciousness could become narcissistic, a kind of aesthetic navel-gazing disconnected from social reality. The difficulty and obscurity of modernist stream of consciousness alienated many readers who found it pretentious or incomprehensible. The assumption that consciousness works the same way for everyone, regardless of class, gender or culture, was questionable. And the elevation of consciousness itself as the primary subject of art could lead to a neglect of external reality, of material conditions and social structures that shape individual experience. Nevertheless, the modernist reimagining of consciousness remains one of its most significant achievements. It fundamentally changed how literature could represent inner life. After Joyce and Woolf, it became impossible to go back to the simple, omniscient narration of 19th-century realism. The complexity they revealed could not be unrevealed. We now understand that consciousness is stranger, more multiple, more opaque than our ancestors imagined. This understanding has become part of the permanent legacy of modernism, influencing not just literature but psychology, philosophy, and our everyday self-understanding. Part 4. The Social Rupture. While modernism is often discussed in terms of aesthetics and consciousness, it cannot be understood apart from the massive social transformations that produced it. Modernism was not simply a set of ideas dreamed up by philosophers and artists in isolation. It was a response to concrete historical conditions that fundamentally altered how human beings lived, worked, and related to each other. The period from roughly 1880 to 1950 witnessed social changes so profound and rapid that they genuinely constituted a rupture in the fabric of civilization. To understand modernism, we must understand this rupture. The most obvious transformation was industrialization. By the late 19th century, industrialization had moved beyond the initial phase of factory production to create entire industrial societies. In Britain, Germany, and increasingly the United States, the majority of the population now lived in cities and worked for wages in industrial enterprises. This represented a complete break with thousands of years of predominantly agricultural life. The rhythms, social structures, and values of agricultural society were being swept away with astonishing speed. What did this mean in concrete terms? It meant the dissolution of traditional communities where people had lived for generations, where everyone knew everyone, where social roles were stable and predictable. It meant the creation of massive cities where millions of strangers lived in close proximity without meaningful social bonds. It meant the replacement of craftwork, where an individual controlled the entire process of making something with factory labour, where workers performed repetitive tasks on assembly lines, producing fragments of products they never saw completed. The psychological impact of these changes was enormous. Workers experienced alienation in its most literal sense. They were separated from the products of their labour, from any sense of meaningful accomplishment, from control over their own time and activity. Karl Marx had analysed this alienation in the mid-19th century, but by the modernist period it had become a universal condition. affecting not just factory workers, but office workers, professionals, and even artists themselves. The cities that industrialization created were unlike anything that had existed before. London, Paris, Berlin, New York. These were metropolitan centres of unprecedented scale, density, and complexity. The urban experience became central to modernist sensibility. The city represented modernity in physical form. Crowds of anonymous strangers, rapid transportation, electric lighting, constant noise and stimulation, the juxtaposition of extreme wealth and poverty, the sense of possibility and danger existing side by side. The modernist response to the city was deeply ambivalent. On one hand, there was excitement about urban energy, about the concentration of culture and sophistication that cities made possible. The city was where the new happened, where traditional constraints were loosened, where one could reinvent oneself. Artists and writers flocked to cities precisely because they offered escape from provincial narrowness and access to international currents of thought and art. On the other hand, there was horror at urban degradation, at the dehumanizing scale of modern cities, at the reduction of human beings to anonymous units in a vast mechanical system. Eliot's Wasteland presents London as a hellish landscape where masses of dead souls cross London Bridge in a spiritual wasteland. The city destroys authentic community and meaningful relationship, replacing them with superficial interactions between atomized individuals. This ambivalence about the city reflected a deeper ambivalence about modernity itself. Modernist artists were both products of modernity and critics of it. They used modern technologies like the printing press, photography, and later film. They benefited from modern communications that allowed rapid exchange of ideas across borders. They depended on modern economic conditions that created a market for avant-garde art and leisure time for cultural consumption. Yet they also diagnosed modernity as a pathology, as fundamentally hostile to human flourishing. Urbanization also transformed perception itself. The city presented a radically new sensory environment. Think about the difference between rural and urban experience. In a rural setting, your attention can focus on single objects, a tree, an animal, another person. The pace is slow enough that you can take things in fully. In the city, you are constantly bombarded with multiple simultaneous stimuli: traffic noise, advertisements, crowds, buildings, vehicles, strangers. You cannot attend to everything. You must develop strategies for filtering, for selective attention, for managing sensory overload. The sociologist Georg Simmel analysed this in his essay on the mental life of the metropolis. He argued that urbanites develop what he called a blasé attitude, a kind of emotional numbness or detachment, as a protective mechanism against overstimulation. You cannot respond emotionally to every stimulus, or you would be exhausted. So you learn to be indifferent, to treat most of what you perceive as mere background. This creates a particular kind of personality, cool and calculating rather than emotionally responsive. Modernist art both reflected and resisted this transformation of perception. The fragmentation and rapid juxtaposition of images in modernist poetry mirrored the sensory bombardment of urban experience. The simultaneity of Cubist painting, showing multiple perspectives at once, captured the urban condition of seeing too much at once. But modernist art also attempted to break through the blasé attitude, to force readers and viewers to actually pay attention, to see and feel intensely rather than filter everything through protective numbness. The technological transformations that accompanied industrialization also profoundly affected modernist sensibility. Photography, invented in the mid-19th century, reached maturity during the modernist period. Its implications for art were revolutionary and disturbing. If a machine could produce accurate visual representations mechanically, what was the point of painting? Why laboriously paint realistic portraits or landscapes when photography could do it better, faster and cheaper? One response was for painting to abandon realistic representation entirely and explore what only painting could do. Pure colour, form, expression, abstraction. This was one path toward modernist visual art. Another response was to argue that photography itself was not objective reproduction, but a form of interpretation and construction. The photographer makes choices about framing, lighting, timing, printing. Photography does not simply copy reality. It creates particular versions of reality from particular perspectives. Cinema, emerging at the turn of the 20th century, presented even more radical possibilities and challenges. Here was a medium that combined visual representation with movement through time, that could juxtapose images rapidly, that could manipulate perception through editing. Cinema could show subjective experience, memory, fantasy in ways that seemed impossible in other media. Many modernist writers were influenced by cinematic techniques, using rapid cuts between scenes, montage, visual imagery. The increased pace of life that technology enabled became a defining feature of modernity. Railways allowed travel at previously unimaginable speeds. Telegraph and telephone allowed instant communication over vast distances. News travelled globally within hours rather than weeks or months. This acceleration had profound psychological effects. The stable world of the past, where change happened slowly and predictably, was replaced by a world of constant flux, where yesterday's truths might be obsolete tomorrow. This acceleration created what some theorists called a crisis of experience. In traditional societies, there was continuity between generations. Parents passed on to children knowledge and values that remained relevant throughout their lives. But when change happens rapidly, this intergenerational transmission breaks down. The world parents grew up in is fundamentally different from the world their children inhabit. Old knowledge becomes obsolete. Traditional wisdom seems irrelevant. Each generation must figure things out anew. Then came World War I, and any remaining optimism about modernity was shattered. The war demonstrated with hideous clarity that technological progress did not mean moral progress. All the scientific and industrial advancement of the previous century was mobilized to kill with unprecedented efficiency. Machine guns, artillery, poison gas, tanks, airplanes, modern technology weaponized. 10 million dead. An entire generation of young men destroyed. And for what? No one could say what the war had achieved that justified its cost. The impact of World War I on modernist consciousness cannot be overstated. It represented the complete bankruptcy of 19th century ideals. Progress, reason, civilization, All the values that the pre-war generation had believed in had led directly to the trenches. The war revealed that underneath the veneer of civilization, Europeans were as capable of savagery as anyone. Indeed, they were better at it, because they had better tools. The war also created a generation of traumatized survivors who could not process or articulate what they had experienced. The old language, the old forms of meaning-making, were inadequate to the reality of industrial warfare. How do you describe the experience of lying in mud for months under constant artillery fire, watching your friends die, knowing you might die at any moment, all for a few yards of territory that would be lost the next week? The conventional language of heroism, glory, sacrifice. It all sounded hollow. This crisis of language and meaning is everywhere in post-war modernism. Hemingway's terse, stripped-down prose style was an attempt to speak truthfully in a world where grand rhetoric had been exposed as empty. His characters are damaged, incapable of articulating their trauma, trying to find meaning in simple physical activities like fishing or bullfighting. Eliot's Wasteland, published in 1922, presents a civilization in ruins, where the fragments of high culture persist but no longer cohere into meaningful wholes. The war also accelerated the social transformations already underway. Women had entered the workforce in large numbers to replace men who were fighting. This made the return to traditional gender roles after the war impossible. The class structures that had governed European society were weakened by the mass slaughter, which affected all classes. The colonial empires that had defined European power were beginning to crack. The certainties of the pre-war world could not be restored. The rise of mass society was another crucial social transformation. By the early 20th century, literacy rates had risen dramatically. Mass circulation newspapers and magazines created a new kind of public sphere. Popular entertainment, from music halls to cinema, reached audiences of millions. This democratization of culture was in some ways progressive, breaking the monopoly of elite culture. But it also created what critics called mass culture, standardized, commercially produced entertainment designed to appeal to the lowest common denominator. Modernists generally despised mass culture. They saw it as debased, manipulative, designed to stupefy rather than enlighten. The contrast between high modernist art and mass culture was stark. While modernist works were difficult, demanding close attention and cultural knowledge, mass culture offered easy pleasures requiring no effort. While modernist art challenged conventional thinking, mass culture reinforced it. While modernist works addressed serious questions of meaning and value, mass culture distracted from such questions with mindless entertainment. This antagonism to mass culture reflected deeper anxieties about democracy and equality. Many modernists were frankly elitist, believing that culture required hierarchy, that not all perspectives are equally valid, that standards of excellence matter more than popularity. They feared that democracy in culture, giving people what they want rather than what they need, would lead to universal mediocrity. The market would drive out quality, replacing it with whatever sells. There was also a political dimension to these concerns. The 1920s and 30s saw the rise of totalitarian movements, fascism in Italy and Germany, Stalinism in the Soviet Union. These movements use modern technologies of mass communication and mobilization to create unprecedented forms of political control. They demonstrated that modernity could produce not just individual freedom, but also collective tyranny. The masses, properly manipulated through propaganda, could become instruments of oppression rather than forces for liberation. Modernists responded to these political developments in diverse and often contradictory ways. Some, like Ezra Pound, embraced fascism, seeing in it a strong leader who could impose order on chaotic modernity. Others, like George Orwell, saw clearly the totalitarian danger and wrote powerfully against it. Many remained politically disengaged, believing that art should remain autonomous from politics. This diversity of political responses shows that modernism as an artistic movement did not dictate any particular political position. The social rupture that produced modernism also involved transformations in class structure and economic life. The old aristocracy was declining, its power and legitimacy undermined by industrialization and war. The bourgeoisie, the middle class of professionals and business owners, was rising to dominance. The working class was becoming organized, forming unions and socialist parties, demanding political power. This class conflict created enormous social tension and anxiety. Many modernist artists came from middle-class or upper-middle-class backgrounds. They had enough economic security to pursue art, enough education to master high culture, but they also felt alienated from bourgeois values and conventions. They despised middle-class Philistinism, the reduction of life to money-making and respectability. But they were also nervous about working-class radicalism, fearing that revolution would destroy the cultural achievements they valued. This left them in a kind of social limbo, critical of the existing order, but unable to imagine a better alternative. The transformation of gender relations was another aspect of the social rupture. Women were demanding political rights, economic independence, sexual freedom. The suffrage movement achieved voting rights in many countries after World War I. Women were entering higher education and professions previously closed to them. Traditional marriage and family structures were being questioned. This created both possibilities and anxieties. Some modernist women writers, like Virginia Woolf, explored female consciousness and experience in unprecedented depth, challenging male-dominated literary traditions. They showed that women's perspectives and concerns were as legitimate subjects for serious art as men's. They exposed the constraints that patriarchal society imposed on women's lives and imaginations. This was genuinely revolutionary. But modernism as a whole was not simply progressive on gender. Many male modernist writers expressed deep anxiety about changing gender roles. They associated modernity with feminization, with the loss of masculine virtues like courage and strength. This led to a cult of masculinity in some modernist work, a nostalgic longing for more heroic ages. Hemingway's emphasis on masculine activities like hunting, fishing and bullfighting can be read as an attempt to preserve traditional masculinity against modern softness. The social rupture also involved changing relationships between Europe and the rest of the world. European colonialism was at its height in the early 20th century, but it was also beginning to face challenges. Colonized peoples were demanding independence. The moral justification for empire, the claim that Europeans were bringing civilization to backward peoples, was wearing thin. The war had shown that Europeans could be as barbaric as anyone. Many modernist artists were influenced by non-Western art and culture. African masks influenced Picasso. Japanese prints influenced Impressionist and Post-Impressionist painting. Eastern philosophy influenced poets like Pound and Eliot. This engagement with non-Western traditions was complex. On one hand, it represented a genuine attempt to learn from other cultures, to break free from narrow European provincialism. On the other hand, it often involved appropriation and exoticization, treating non-Western cultures as resources to be mined, rather than as equals in dialogue. All of these social transformations, industrialization, urbanization, technological change, World War I, mass society, class conflict, gender transformation, colonial crisis, created the conditions for modernism. The movement cannot be understood apart from these historical forces. Modernism was an attempt to create forms of art and thought adequate to an utterly transformed world. A world where the old certainties no longer held, where traditional forms seemed obsolete, where the pace of change threatened to outrun the human capacity to make sense of experience. The social rupture produced an aesthetic and philosophical rupture that we call modernism. Part 5. Manifestations across domains. Having examined the philosophical foundations, worldview, treatment of consciousness, and social context of modernism, we now turn to how these abstract ideas manifested in concrete artistic practice. Modernism was not just a set of theories. It produced actual works in literature, visual arts, music and architecture that attempted to embody its principles and respond to its challenges. These works are the test of modernist ideas. Do they succeed in their aims? Do they reveal aspects of reality that conventional forms miss? Do they create new possibilities for human expression and understanding? Let us examine the major domains of modernist practice. In literature, modernism produced works of extraordinary innovation and difficulty. James Joyce's Ulysses, published in 1922, is perhaps the single most ambitious and influential modernist novel. On the surface, it tells the story of a single day, June 16, 1904, in Dublin, following the wanderings of Leopold Bloom, an advertising salesman, and Stephen Dedalus, a young intellectual. But this simple frame contains multitudes. Joyce structured the novel as a modern retelling of Homer's Odyssey, with episodes corresponding to adventures in the ancient epic. But Joyce's heroes are decidedly unheroic. An ordinary middle-aged man and an alienated young artist wandering through an ordinary city on an ordinary day. The point is not to diminish Homer, but to show that everyday life contains its own epics, its own depths of meaning and significance, if we pay proper attention. Each episode of Ulysses is written in a different style, using different techniques to capture different aspects of reality. Some episodes use stream of consciousness. Others parody various literary styles. One episode is written as a play script. Another consists of questions and answers like a catechism. This variety of techniques reflects Joyce's belief that reality is too complex to be captured by any single style or perspective. Different aspects of experience require different modes of representation. The book culminates in Molly Bloom's unpunctuated interior monologue, which we discussed earlier. This final episode, consisting of 8 long sentences spanning 40 pages, represents consciousness at its most fluid and uncensored. Molly's thoughts move freely across her entire life, from childhood memories to present concerns, from practical matters to sexual desires, from resentments to affirmations. The famous final word, yes, repeated multiple times, represents an acceptance of life in all its complexity and messiness. Ulysses was scandalous when published, banned for obscenity in the United States and Britain. It depicted bodily functions, sexual thoughts, and everyday vulgarity with unprecedented frankness. But this frankness served a purpose. Joyce was attempting to represent life completely, without the prudish exclusions that Victorian literature had imposed. Human beings are bodies as well as minds. They urinate and defecate and think about sex. Any literature that pretends otherwise is false. The book is also extraordinarily learned, filled with references to Irish history, Catholic theology, Shakespearean criticism, medieval scholasticism, popular culture, and dozens of other domains. This learning is not mere showing off. It reflects Joyce's belief that modern consciousness is palimpsestic, layered with accumulated cultural materials. We think with and through the traditions we have inherited, even when we are engaged in the most mundane activities. Virginia Woolf's novels represent a different but equally radical modernist approach. Her work is less overtly experimental than Joyce's, but perhaps more subtle in its psychological insight. Mrs. Dalloway follows a day in the life of Clarissa Dalloway as she prepares for a party she is hosting that evening. Like Ulysses, it takes an ordinary day and reveals its depths. But where Joyce emphasizes the material and bodily, Woolf emphasizes the delicate textures of consciousness, the play of memory and perception, the way present moments resonate with the past. The novel also explores the relationship between different consciousnesses. Clarissa's consciousness is juxtaposed with that of Septimus Warren Smith, a shell-shocked war veteran who commits suicide during the day of the novel. The two characters never meet, but their stories are linked thematically. Both are sensitive souls overwhelmed by the demands of modern life. Both struggle with questions of meaning and value in a world that seems increasingly mechanical and inhuman. Woolf's To the Lighthouse is structured more explicitly around temporality. The novel is divided into 3 parts. The first and third parts take place over single days, separated by 10 years. The middle section, much shorter, covers those intervening 10 years in a few pages of rushing prose. This structure makes visible what is usually invisible, the asymmetry between lived time and chronological time. We experience some moments with great intensity and duration, while years can pass almost unnoticed. The novel also explores questions of permanence and transience. Mrs. Ramsay, the central figure of the first part, dies between the first and third sections. Her absence shapes everything that follows. Yet she continues to exist in the memories of other characters, influencing their thoughts and actions. Woolf asks, what is death when the dead continue to live in the consciousness of survivors? What kind of immortality is this? T.S. Eliot's poetry represents modernism's engagement with cultural crisis and the fragmentation of meaning. The Wasteland, published the same year as Ulysses, is a collage of voices, styles, languages, and references. The poem moves between contemporary London and ancient mythology, between high literary language and popular songs, between English and other European languages, often without clear transitions or explanations. The effect is deliberately disorienting. Eliot wants readers to experience the fragmentation of modern culture, where coherent tradition has collapsed into disconnected fragments. The poem is filled with allusions to literature, religion, and mythology, but these allusions do not create meaning. They show the impossibility of creating meaning through traditional cultural materials in the modern context. The fragments remain fragments, unable to be synthesized into a satisfying whole. Yet the poem is not simply nihilistic. It ends with Sanskrit words from the Hindu Upanishads, Shanti, 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 meaning peace. This suggests that meaning might be found by looking beyond Western tradition, by drawing on non-Western spiritual resources. But the gesture is tentative, uncertain. The peace invoked may not be achievable in the modern world. Eliot's later poetry, particularly 4 quartets, explores similar themes with greater serenity and depth. These long meditative poems grapple with time, memory, history, and the possibility of transcendent meaning. They show Eliot moving toward religious faith, specifically Anglo-Catholicism, as a response to the nihilism he had diagnosed in The Wasteland. Whether this move represents a solution or an evasion of the problems modernism raised remains debatable. Franz Kafka's fiction represents another dimension of modernist literature. His novels and stories depict worlds that are recognizably modern, yet nightmarishly distorted. In The Trial, Joseph K. is arrested for an unnamed crime and must navigate an incomprehensible legal system that ultimately executes him without ever revealing his offence. In The Castle, a land surveyor arrives in a village dominated by a distant castle and spends the entire novel trying unsuccessfully to gain admission to the castle authorities. These works can be read as allegories of modern life, where individuals are subject to vast bureaucratic systems they do not understand and cannot control. The systems operate according to their own opaque logic, indifferent to individual needs or justice. Authority is distant, inaccessible, arbitrary. Meaning is withheld. This was Kafka's vision of modernity, a world of alienation and absurdity, where rational understanding is impossible and human dignity is under constant threat. In the visual arts, modernism began with Impressionism and Post-Impressionism in the late 19th century, then exploded into multiple movements in the early 20th century. Fauvism, Expressionism, Cubism, Futurism, Dada, Surrealism, Abstract Expressionism. Each of these movements represented different responses to the crisis of representation that photography had precipitated, and that modernity demanded. Pablo Picasso's Les Demoiselles d'Avignon, painted in 1907, is often cited as the breakthrough work of modernist painting. It depicts 5 female figures, but they are radically fragmented and distorted. Some faces appear mask-like, influenced by African sculpture. The figures are shown from multiple perspectives simultaneously, violating the rules of perspective that had governed Western painting since the Renaissance. Space is flattened and fractured. The painting shocked even Picasso's friends when they first saw it. It seemed deliberately ugly, violating all standards of beauty. But this was precisely the point. Picasso was rejecting the idea that art should be beautiful in conventional terms. He was asking, what if the deeper truth about reality requires ugliness, requires showing things in ways that disturb rather than please? Cubism, developed by Picasso and Georges Braque, took this fragmentation further. Cubist paintings show objects from multiple viewpoints at once, breaking them into geometric planes that intersect and overlap. A face might show profile and frontal view simultaneously. This technique rejected single-point perspective, the idea that paintings should show how things look from one fixed position. The philosophical implication was clear. There is no single correct view of reality. Every perspective is partial. To represent something more fully, you must show multiple perspectives together, even if this creates visual confusion. Cubism was not trying to show how things look to normal perception. It was trying to show a more comprehensive understanding that transcends single viewpoints. Abstract art took the rejection of representation even further. Wassily Kandinsky argued that painting should be like music, creating emotional and spiritual effects through pure form and color without depicting recognizable objects. His abstract paintings use colors, lines, and shapes to create compositions that appeal directly to feeling rather than intellect. The goal was to bypass representation entirely and achieve direct emotional communication. This move to abstraction was both liberation and loss. Liberation because it freed art from the obligation to depict external reality, allowing artists to explore pure aesthetic relationships. Loss because it severed the connection between art and the world, making art self-referential and potentially meaningless to viewers who could not decode its formal language. The Surrealists, led by André Breton, took a different approach. Rather than abandoning representation, they depicted impossible juxtapositions, dream images, unconscious desires made visible. Salvador Dali's melting clocks, René Magritte's men in bowler hats floating in the sky, Max Ernst's strange hybrid creatures. These images represent the unconscious mind, where normal logic and causality do not apply. Surrealism was directly influenced by Freudian psychoanalysis. The Surrealists believed that accessing the unconscious through dreams, automatic writing, and free association could reveal deeper truths than rational consciousness could access. Their art was an attempt to give visible form to invisible psychic realities. The strangeness and irrationality of surrealist images reflected the strangeness and irrationality of the unconscious itself. In architecture, modernism meant the rejection of historical styles and ornament in favor of functional design using new materials like steel, glass, and reinforced concrete. The slogan "Form follows function," associated with architect Louis Sullivan, captured the modernist architectural ethos. Buildings should express their purpose directly, rather than disguising it with decorative elements borrowed from past styles. Le Corbusier, one of the most influential modernist architects, envisioned cities of tall towers set in parkland, with separation of pedestrian and vehicular traffic, efficient circulation, abundant light and air. His designs were based on rational planning principles aimed at improving human life through better design. He believed that architecture could transform society, that properly designed buildings and cities could create better, healthier, more rational ways of living. The results were mixed. Modernist architecture produced some buildings of great beauty and innovation. Mies van der Rohe's Barcelona Pavilion with its elegant proportions and flowing space. Frank Lloyd Wright's Falling Water with its dramatic integration of building and landscape. But modernist urban planning also produced soulless housing projects and dead urban spaces, demonstrating that functional efficiency does not automatically create livable environments. The rejection of ornament and historical reference meant that modernist buildings often looked austere, even harsh. Critics complained that they lacked human scale, warmth, connection to place and tradition. The international style, as modernist architecture came to be called, could be built anywhere, making everywhere look the same. This universalism was both strength and weakness. Strength because it transcended provincial particularism. Weakness because it destroyed local identity and character. In music, modernism involved the breakdown of tonality and conventional harmonic structure. Arnold Schoenberg developed the 12-tone technique, treating all 12 notes of the chromatic scale as equal rather than organizing them hierarchically around a tonic key. This created music that sounded strange and dissonant to ears trained on tonal music. Schoenberg argued that tonality had been exhausted, that composers needed new organizing principles to continue developing music. Igor Stravinsky's The Rite of Spring, premiered in 1913, caused a riot at its first performance. The music used primitive rhythms, harsh dissonances, and irregular meters to depict a pagan ritual culminating in human sacrifice. It violated all expectations of what ballet music should sound like: elegant, melodic, rhythmically regular. Instead, it was brutal, jarring, deliberately savage. The riot at the premiere revealed how shocking modernist art could be. Audiences were not just puzzled or uninterested. They were actively offended, feeling that their deepest aesthetic and moral values were being attacked. This was not accidental. Modernists wanted to shock, to force people out of complacent acceptance of conventional ideas. The shock was meant to be productive, to open up new possibilities of perception and thought. These manifestations across literature, visual art, architecture and music shared common features. They all involved formal experimentation, rejection of conventional representation, emphasis on subjective experience, engagement with unconscious and irrational dimensions of mind, and willingness to be difficult or obscure in pursuit of deeper truths. They all responded to the same historical crisis, the sense that traditional forms were inadequate to modern experience. But they also revealed the limitations and contradictions of modernism. The difficulty and obscurity that modernism embraced made its works inaccessible to most people. The rejection of conventional beauty often produced art that seemed merely ugly or incoherent. The emphasis on subjective experience could become self-indulgent. The break with tradition could lead to rootlessness and nihilism. These problems would eventually provoke both internal critique and external reaction against modernism, issues we will explore in subsequent parts. Part 6. Where Modernism Failed. No intellectual movement, however revolutionary or influential, is without failures and blind spots. Modernism's failures are particularly instructive because they reveal tensions and contradictions inherent in the project itself. To understand modernism fully requires confronting where it went wrong, where its ambitions exceeded its grasp, where its principles led to outcomes its practitioners did not intend or could not justify. This is not a matter of pointing out minor flaws in an otherwise successful enterprise. These are fundamental failures that compromise core modernist claims and reveal deep problems in modernist assumptions. The most obvious failure was elitism. Modernism created art that was deliberately inaccessible to ordinary people. This was not accidental or incidental. It was built into the modernist project. Modernists believed that serious art should be difficult, that it should require effort, education, and cultural sophistication to understand. They despised easy pleasures and popular entertainment. They believed that most people had debased taste and that catering to mass audiences meant compromising artistic integrity. This elitism had multiple dimensions. First, there was intellectual elitism. Modernist works assumed readers or viewers with extensive cultural knowledge. To understand the wasteland, you need to recognize allusions to Shakespeare, Dante, the Upanishads, Wagner, Augustine, and dozens of other sources. To appreciate Ulysses requires knowledge of Homer, Catholic theology, Irish history, and much more. Without this background, these works are largely incomprehensible. Second, there was aesthetic elitism. Modernists rejected conventional standards of beauty and pleasure. They valued difficulty, dissonance, fragmentation, techniques that required audiences to work hard and often produced discomfort rather than enjoyment. This meant that even educated audiences often found modernist works unpleasant or frustrating. The works seemed designed to exclude rather than include, to separate the sophisticated few from the ignorant many. Third, there was social elitism. Most modernist artists came from middle-class or upper-middle-class backgrounds. They had the economic security and educational advantages that allowed them to pursue experimental art. They moved in bohemian circles of other artists and intellectuals, creating insular communities where they could support and validate each other. They had little contact with or understanding of working-class life, despite sometimes romanticizing workers or claiming to speak for oppressed masses. This elitism created a profound disconnect between modernist artists and the general public. Modernist works were read and admired by small audiences of other intellectuals and artists, but they had little impact on how most people actually lived or thought. The avant-garde became a self-enclosed world, producing art for itself rather than for society. This contradicted modernist claims to be revealing fundamental truths about modern existence. If these truths were truly fundamental, why could they only be understood by a tiny, educated elite? The defenders of modernist elitism argued that difficulty was necessary for several reasons. First, reality itself is complex, and representing it truthfully requires complex forms that cannot be immediately grasped. Second, easy art panders to existing prejudices rather than challenging them. Third, the effort required to understand difficult art is itself valuable, forcing audiences to think rather than passively consume. Fourth, not all human activities need to be equally accessible to everyone. We accept that higher mathematics or theoretical physics requires specialized training, so why not art? These defenses are not without merit, but they do not fully answer the charge. The issue is not whether some art should be challenging. The issue is whether modernism's particular form of difficulty served its stated purposes or became an end in itself, a way of maintaining cultural distinction and superiority. When difficulty functions primarily to separate insiders from outsiders, when it becomes a marker of class and education rather than a necessary response to complexity, it has ceased to be intellectually justified and become merely exclusionary. A related failure was modernism's inadequate engagement with political and social reality. Despite emerging from profound social transformations and crisis, much modernist art turned inward, focusing on consciousness, aesthetics, and personal experience while neglecting material conditions and collective action. This retreat from social engagement had multiple causes and manifestations. Some modernists explicitly rejected political commitment, arguing that art should remain autonomous, that subordinating aesthetic concerns to political purposes compromised artistic integrity. They believed that art serves humanity better by maintaining its independence and exploring aesthetic and philosophical questions than by becoming propaganda for particular causes. This position has philosophical merit, but it also conveniently absolved artists of responsibility for the social consequences of their work and ideas. Other modernists did engage politically, but often in troubling ways. A disturbing number of major modernist figures were attracted to authoritarian politics. Ezra Pound became an enthusiastic supporter of Mussolini and made pro-fascist radio broadcasts during World War II. T. S. Eliot expressed anti-Semitic views and flirted with authoritarian conservatism. Wyndham Lewis supported Hitler. W. B. Yeats was drawn to fascist movements. These were not minor figures, but central architects of literary modernism. This pattern demands explanation. Why were so many modernists attracted to fascism? Several factors contributed. First, modernist contempt for democracy and mass culture aligned with fascist elitism and authoritarianism. If most people are incapable of understanding truth or beauty, if democracy produces only mediocrity, then perhaps strong leadership by exceptional individuals is necessary. This was exactly what fascism promised. Second, modernist nostalgia for pre-modern forms of social order, for organic communities and traditional hierarchies, resonated with fascist rhetoric about returning to mythic pasts and rejecting modern decadence. Third, the modernist cult of strength, creativity and will to power could easily be translated into fascist celebrations of violence and domination. Fourth, modernist anti-rationalism, the rejection of Enlightenment faith in reason and progress, left a vacuum that authoritarian ideologies could fill. Not all modernists went this direction. George Orwell, W.H. Auden in his later years, and others saw clearly the totalitarian danger and wrote powerfully against it. But the fact that so many did embrace or sympathize with fascism reveals something troubling about modernist thought. The combination of elitism, anti-democratic sentiment, nostalgia for hierarchy, and celebration of irrational will created preconditions for authoritarian politics, even when individual artists did not intend this outcome. Another failure was modernism's treatment of gender. Despite some remarkable women modernist artists who challenged patriarchal assumptions, Modernism as a whole often reproduced or intensified misogyny. Male modernist writers frequently depicted women as threatening, mysterious, sexually voracious, intellectually inferior, or spiritually redemptive, but never as fully human equals. Women characters in modernist fiction are often projections of male anxiety or desire rather than complex subjects in their own right. The modernist cult of masculine creativity and power marginalized women's contributions. The myth of the artist as isolated genius struggling to create in defiance of society was implicitly masculine. Women artists who did not fit this myth were ignored or dismissed. Virginia Woolf brilliantly analyzed this problem in A Room of One's Own, showing how material and cultural conditions made it nearly impossible for women to achieve recognition as serious artists. Even modernist formal techniques often encoded gender assumptions. Stream of consciousness, with its emphasis on fluid, emotional, associative thinking, was sometimes dismissed as feminine and therefore inferior. The hard, objective, impersonal style championed by T. S. Eliot and others was coded as masculine and superior. These gendered valuations reinforced existing hierarchies even within supposedly revolutionary artistic movements. Modernism also failed adequately to address race and colonialism. Despite appropriating elements from African, Asian and other non-Western cultures, modernists rarely treated these cultures as equals. Non-Western art was valued for its supposed primitiveness, its connection to primal forces that over-civilized Europeans had lost. This was primitivism, not genuine engagement. It exoticized and objectified non-Western peoples, treating their cultural productions as resources to be mined rather than as sophisticated achievements in their own right. The few modernist works that directly address colonialism, like Joseph Conrad's Heart of Darkness, often reproduced racist assumptions even while critiquing colonial practices. Conrad's novella depicts the horrors of Belgian colonialism in the Congo, but it does so by presenting Africans as silent, mysterious, incomprehensible others. The critique of colonialism remains within a European frame of reference, unable to imagine African perspectives or agency. This brings us to a deeper failure: modernism's inability to overcome the Eurocentrism it sometimes critiqued. Despite rejecting many Western traditions and drawing on non-Western sources, modernism remained fundamentally a European and North American phenomenon. It assumed that the crisis of modernity was universal, that everyone was experiencing the same fragmentation and loss of meaning. But this was a projection of European experience onto the rest of the world. For colonized peoples, the crisis was not the death of God or the fragmentation of consciousness. It was material oppression, political subjugation, cultural destruction imposed by European colonial powers. Modernist concerns about the inadequacy of language or the impossibility of objective representation must have seemed absurdly self-indulgent to people facing poverty, violence, and the theft of their lands and resources. Modernism's focus on aesthetic and philosophical problems reflected the luxury of relatively privileged positions. Another significant failure was modernism's relationship to technology and industrialization. Modernists were profoundly ambivalent about technology, both fascinated and repelled by it. Some movements, like Italian futurism, celebrated technology and speed, advocating the destruction of the past and embracing the machine age. But this celebration often had troubling implications, glorifying violence and war as forms of technological achievement and social purification. Other modernists were more critical, seeing technology as dehumanizing, as reducing humans to mechanical functions. But this critique rarely developed into serious analysis of how technology actually operates in capitalist society, how it is shaped by social relations and economic imperatives rather than being autonomous force. Modernists tended to treat technology as fate, as an impersonal force transforming society, rather than as something produced by human decisions that could be challenged and changed. This political and economic naivety was a broader modernist failing. Despite emerging from the devastation of World War I and the economic crises of the 1920s and 30s, modernism produced little serious engagement with capitalism as a system. There were Marxist critics and artists, but they were often marginal to mainstream modernism. The focus on consciousness, aesthetics, and individual experience meant that structural economic analysis was largely absent. When modernists did engage with economics, it was often in reactionary ways, nostalgic for pre-modern economic arrangements or advocating corporatist alternatives to both capitalism and socialism. Pound's economic views, such as they were, combined conspiracy theories about banking with incoherent proposals for monetary reform. This was not serious political economy. It was aestheticized politics, treating economic questions as extensions of cultural and artistic concerns. Perhaps the deepest failure of modernism was its inability to resolve the problem it diagnosed. Modernism brilliantly articulated the crisis of meaning in modern life, the collapse of traditional sources of value and purpose. But it could not provide convincing alternatives. The various solutions modernists proposed, aesthetic creation as its own justification, return to religious faith, embrace of authoritarian politics, retreat into private consciousness, none of these resolved the fundamental problem. Aesthetic autonomy, the idea that art creates its own values independent of external purposes, could not bear the weight modernism placed on it. If nothing matters except what we choose to value, if there are no objective grounds for judgment, then why should we value difficult art over easy entertainment? Why is Joyce better than popular fiction, except that sophisticated people say so? The claim that aesthetic value is self-evident could not be sustained when most people evidently did not perceive it. The return to religious faith that some modernists embraced seemed like an evasion rather than solution. Having accepted that religious worldviews are human constructions rather than objective truths, having subjected religious claims to devastating critique, simply deciding to believe anyway appears intellectually dishonest. Eliot's conversion to Anglo-Catholicism resolved his personal crisis but did not address the philosophical problems he had raised. It was a leap of faith that others could not be expected to make. The authoritarian political solutions were moral disasters that discredited those who pursued them, and retreat into private consciousness left the social world unchallenged, accepting alienation and fragmentation as inevitable rather than fighting to transform the conditions that produced them. Modernism also failed to create sustainable communities or institutions. The avant-garde movements were inherently unstable, held together by charismatic leaders and shared opposition to convention. They fractured into competing factions, with former allies denouncing each other. The little magazines and galleries that supported modernist work were chronically underfunded and short-lived. There was no mechanism for transmitting modernist practices to new generations except through universities, which modernists generally despised as bastions of conventional thinking. This institutional fragility meant that modernism could not consolidate its achievements or build on them systematically. Each artist or movement had to start over, rejecting not just tradition, but also immediate predecessors. The imperative to make it new, to be original and innovative, meant that modernism was constantly overthrowing itself. This created exciting dynamism, but also exhausting instability and lack of cumulative progress. The problem of communication was another failure. If modernist techniques succeed in representing consciousness and reality more truthfully than conventional forms, why do most people find them incomprehensible? Either the techniques fail to communicate, in which case they are aesthetic dead ends, or most people lack the capacity to understand them, in which case modernism has given up on speaking to humanity as a whole. Neither conclusion is satisfactory. Some modernists acknowledged this problem but had no solution. They hoped that over time, as audiences became educated in modernist techniques, the communication gap would close. This happened to some degree. Works that shocked initial audiences became canonical, taught in universities, absorbed into high culture. But this absorption often meant domestication, the neutralizing of modernist radicalism by treating it as just another period style to be studied rather than a living challenge. There was also the problem of what came after. Modernism defined itself through negation and opposition. It knew what it rejected, but was less clear about what it affirmed. Once the initial shock wore off, once fragmentation and difficulty became expected rather than surprising, what remained? Could modernist techniques be sustained indefinitely, or did they depend on their novelty for their power? And if they could not be sustained, what would replace them? This question became urgent by mid-century. Late modernism, the work produced in the 1940s and 50s, often felt exhausted, repeating earlier innovations without the original urgency. Abstract expressionism in painting pushed abstraction to extremes, but then had nowhere further to go. Experimental fiction continued stream of consciousness and fragmentation, but with diminishing returns. The techniques that had seemed revolutionary in 1920 felt mannered by 1960. The rise of postmodernism in the 1960s and 70s can be understood partly as a response to modernism's failures. Postmodernism rejected modernist seriousness and elitism, embracing popular culture, pastiche, irony and playfulness. It challenged modernist belief in originality and authenticity, arguing that everything is always already a copy or quotation. It questioned modernist faith that beneath superficial appearances lies deeper reality waiting to be revealed. Whether postmodernism successfully moved beyond modernism or merely inverted its terms without escaping its framework remains debatable. But postmodernism's emergence demonstrated that modernism had reached its limits, that its contradictions had become unsustainable, that new approaches were necessary. The failures of modernism were not incidental. They were built into the project inevitable consequences of its assumptions and methods. Understanding these failures does not mean dismissing modernism entirely. Many of its achievements remain valuable. Its insights into consciousness, its critique of naive realism, its expansion of artistic possibilities, these contributions are permanent. But the failures matter because they show that modernism cannot simply be celebrated or imitated. Its problems must be confronted and its limitations acknowledged if we are to learn from it rather than repeat its mistakes. Part 7. Scholarly Battles. Modernism has not only been the subject of artistic practice, but also of intense scholarly debate. Academics have fought for decades over fundamental questions. What is modernism? When did it begin and end? What are its essential characteristics? How should we evaluate its achievements and failures? Which works and artists should be considered central and which peripheral? These debates are not mere academic quibbling. They reflect genuine uncertainty about how to understand a phenomenon that was itself profoundly concerned with questions of definition, value, and meaning. The first major battlefield is definition. What exactly is modernism? The term has been used to describe such diverse works and movements that it sometimes seems to lose all coherent meaning. Is modernism defined by chronology, referring to art produced during a particular historical period? Or is it defined by aesthetic characteristics, referring to works that share certain formal features regardless of when they were produced? Or is it defined philosophically, referring to works that embody particular ideas about reality, consciousness, and representation? Scholars have proposed all of these definitions and more, leading to fundamental disagreements about what should be included under the modernist label. Some define modernism narrowly, restricting it to experimental high art produced between approximately 1910 and 1940 by figures like Joyce, Woolf, Eliot, Picasso, and Stravinsky. This narrow definition emphasizes radical formal innovation, difficulty, and self-conscious rejection of tradition. Others define modernism more broadly, extending it backward to include late 19th century precursors like Baudelaire, Nietzsche, and Cézanne, and forward to include post-World War II developments like abstract expressionism and the Nouveau Roman. This broader definition emphasizes continuities and development rather than sharp breaks. It sees modernism as a long process of transformation rather than a concentrated moment of revolution. Still, others argue that modernism should be understood not as a period or style, but as an ongoing project or attitude, a critical engagement with modernity that continues into the present. In this view, contemporary artists and writers who question conventional forms and engage seriously with problems of representation and meaning are still doing modernist work. The chronological boundaries become irrelevant, or at least porous. These definitional disputes matter because they determine what gets studied and how. If you define modernism narrowly around a small canon of experimental works, you miss broader transformations in culture and consciousness. If you define it too broadly, the term becomes so inclusive that it explains nothing. The challenge is finding a definition that is both specific enough to be useful and capacious enough to capture the phenomenon's complexity. Related to the definitional debate is the question of periodization. When did modernism begin and end? Most scholars place its flowering in the early 20th century, particularly the period from 1910 to 1930. But the beginning is disputed. Did modernism begin with Impressionism in the 1870s? With Baudelaire's poetry in mid-century? with Romanticism's challenge to Enlightenment rationalism, or even with Renaissance humanism's break from medieval scholasticism. Each proposed beginning point reflects different assumptions about what is essential to modernism. If you think modernism is fundamentally about rejecting representation, you might start with Impressionism or later. If you think it is about rejecting Enlightenment rationalism, you might start earlier, with Romantic reactions against the 18th century. If you think it is about the self-conscious awareness of modernity as a problem, you might trace it back to the Renaissance. The ending is equally contentious. Some scholars argue that modernism ended around World War II, superseded by postmodernism. Others claim it continued through the 1960s or beyond. Still others argue that modernism has not ended at all, that we remain within the modernist project even if in a late or modified phase. These disputes reflect different views about what constitutes a fundamental break versus mere evolution. The concept of high modernism versus late modernism has generated significant debate. High modernism refers to the classic period of experimental innovation in the 1920s and 30s. Late modernism refers to work produced after World War II that continues modernist techniques but with different historical consciousness, aware that the initial revolutionary moment has passed. Some scholars argue this distinction is crucial for understanding how modernist practices changed over time. Others argue it creates false divisions and obscures continuities. An even more contentious issue is the relationship between modernism and postmodernism. Are these completely different movements, representing opposed principles and practices? Or is postmodernism simply late modernism under another name? Or is postmodernism a critical response to modernism that nevertheless remains entangled with what it critiques? Those who emphasize the break argue that postmodernism represents fundamental philosophical and aesthetic shifts. Where modernism believed in depth beneath surface, postmodernism argues there is only surface. Where modernism valued originality and authenticity, postmodernism celebrates pastiche and appropriation. Where modernism maintained faith in art's ability to reveal truth, postmodernism is skeptical about all truth claims. Where modernism was serious and often tragic in sensibility, postmodernism is playful and ironic. Those who emphasize continuity argue that postmodernism intensifies tendencies already present in modernism. Modernist collage becomes postmodernist pastiche. Modernist stream of consciousness becomes postmodernist textuality. Modernist rejection of unified self becomes postmodernist deconstruction of identity. In this view, postmodernism does not break with modernism, but pushes its logic to more extreme conclusions. A third position holds that the modernism versus postmodernism debate is itself a modernist debate, dependent on modernist assumptions about historical rupture, avant-garde innovation, and the death of previous movements. Perhaps the whole framework should be questioned rather than trying to determine where one ends and another begins. Another major scholarly controversy concerns the politics of modernism. Was modernism inherently conservative or progressive? Was it aligned with left-wing radicalism or right-wing reaction? Or was it politically diverse, with different modernists taking different positions? The evidence supports all these views, which is precisely the problem. Left-wing critics argue that modernism was fundamentally reactionary. Its elitism, contempt for democracy, nostalgia for pre-modern social orders, and attraction to authoritarian politics all indicate conservative or fascist sympathies. The focus on aesthetic autonomy and individual consciousness represents bourgeois withdrawal from political engagement, tacit acceptance of capitalist exploitation. The difficulty and obscurity of modernist works prevented them from serving progressive political purposes. Right-wing critics ironically make similar charges from the opposite direction. They see modernism as nihilistic, destructive of tradition and social order, promoting moral relativism and cultural decay. The rejection of beauty, coherence and meaning undermines civilizational values. The embrace of primitivism, irrationalism and transgression threatens social stability. In this view, modernism is cultural Marxism avant la lettre, softening up Western civilization for political subversion. Progressive defenders of modernism argue that its challenge to convention, its exposure of bourgeois hypocrisy, its expansion of who counts as a legitimate subject for serious art, all these represent progressive achievements. The formal innovations enabled new ways of representing previously excluded experiences. The critique of rationalism exposed instrumental reason's complicity with oppression. The difficulty was necessary to avoid easy recuperation by dominant ideology. Conservative defenders argue that modernism preserved high cultural standards against mass culture's onslaught. Its difficulty maintained important distinctions between serious art and entertainment. Its formal innovations demonstrated human creative capacity even in conditions of social disintegration. Its engagement with tradition, even critical engagement, kept classical learning alive. The truth is that modernism was politically incoherent. Different artists held radically different political views. The same techniques could serve opposing purposes. Fragmentation could represent either capitalist alienation or revolutionary disruption. Difficulty could either maintain elite privilege or challenge comfortable assumptions. Stream of consciousness could either reveal universal human interiority or expose the particularity of bourgeois consciousness. Modernist art was politically polyvalent, open to multiple interpretations and uses. This recognition has led some scholars to abandon the search for modernism's essential politics, instead examining how particular works function in specific historical contexts. Rather than asking whether modernism as a whole is progressive or conservative, we should ask how specific modernist techniques and works have been mobilized for different political projects. This contextual approach is more nuanced, but also more limited, unable to make broad claims about the political significance of modernist innovation. The question of canon formation has been another battlefield. Which works and artists should be considered central to modernism? The traditional canon emphasized a small number of mostly male, mostly white, mostly European and North American figures. This canon privileged experimental difficulty over accessibility, high art over popular forms, metropolitan sophistication over provincial simplicity. Feminist scholars challenged this canon by recovering neglected women modernists and showing how gender shaped both artistic production and critical reception. They demonstrated that women writers like Dorothy Richardson, D. Juna Barnes and others made crucial contributions that had been marginalized or forgotten. They also showed how supposedly universal modernist techniques often encoded masculine perspectives. Post-colonial scholars challenged the Eurocentrism of modernist studies, recovering non-Western modernisms and showing how colonialism shaped European modernism even when not explicitly thematized. They argued that modernism was a global phenomenon, not just European, and that non-Western artists engaged with modernity in sophisticated ways that deserve recognition. The traditional focus on London, Paris and New York obscured vibrant modernist movements in Latin America, Africa and Asia. Scholars of popular culture challenged the high and low distinction that modernist studies had inherited from modernism itself. They showed that supposedly high modernist works borrowed extensively from popular forms like jazz, film, advertising and mass media. They argued that rigid separation of high and low culture was untenable, that modernism was always already contaminated by what it claimed to reject. This led to expanded definitions of modernism that included popular modernisms and mass-market experimental work. These challenges have transformed modernist studies, expanding the canon significantly and changing how canonical figures are understood. But they have also created new problems. If we expand the canon indefinitely, does modernism lose all specificity? If every artist engaging with modernity counts as modernist, what analytical work does the term do? How do we balance the legitimate goal of recovering marginalized voices with the need to maintain some coherent sense of what makes modernism distinctive? The debate over modernist difficulty is another persistent controversy. Was difficulty essential to modernist achievement or an elitist exclusion tactic? Did formal complexity enable truths inaccessible to conventional forms, or merely demonstrate cultural capital? Should we celebrate modernist difficulty as intellectual and aesthetic achievement, or critique it as barrier to democratic culture? Defenders of difficulty argue that complex realities require complex representations. Consciousness is not simple. So stream of consciousness cannot be simple. Modern life is fragmentary, so modernist art must be fragmentary. To demand easy accessibility is to demand falsification. Moreover, the effort required to understand difficult works produces unique satisfactions and insights that easy works cannot provide. Difficulty trains attention, develops interpretive skills, and resists commodification. Critics argue that difficulty often serves no purpose beyond demonstrating sophistication. Much modernist obscurity results from private associations, specialized knowledge requirements, and deliberately cryptic techniques that prevent communication rather than enabling deeper understanding. The claim that reality itself requires such difficulty is question-begging. Reality is available to ordinary perception and can be represented in accessible ways. The cult of difficulty maintains class distinctions and professional expertise rather than serving genuine aesthetic or cognitive purposes. A middle position acknowledges that some difficulty is justified while some is not. The challenge is distinguishing necessary complexity from unnecessary obscurity. This requires case-by-case judgment rather than blanket defences or condemnations of difficulty. It also requires attention to who is excluded by difficulty and whether that exclusion serves legitimate purposes or merely reproduces privilege. The question of modernism's relationship to the market has generated significant scholarly attention. Modernists often presented themselves as opposed to commercialism, creating art for its own sake rather than for profit. They contrasted their integrity with the prostitution of popular artists, who gave audiences what they wanted. But this anti-commercial stance was always compromised. Modernist artists needed income. They depended on galleries, publishers, and patrons. They developed markets for their work, even if small and specialized markets. Some scholars argue that modernism's difficulty was actually a market strategy, creating scarcity and distinction that enhanced value. By making their work inaccessible to mass audiences, modernists created niche markets where cultural capital could be traded. The difficulty was not opposition to the market, but a particular form of market positioning. This cynical interpretation challenges modernist self-understanding, but may capture something true about how modernist art functioned economically. Others argue that modernism genuinely attempted to resist commodification, even if imperfectly. The refusal of easy pleasure, the rejection of entertainment value, the creation of works that could not be passively consumed, these represented real opposition to market logic, even if modernist artists could not entirely escape market conditions. The tension between aesthetical autonomy and economic necessity was real and shaped modernist practice in complex ways. The debate over modernism's universalism versus particularism reflects fundamental philosophical tensions. Did modernism reveal universal truths about human consciousness and modern experience? Or did it express particular perspectives falsely presented as universal? The answer matters for how we evaluate modernist claims and whether we see modernist techniques as having ongoing validity. Universalist interpretations argue that beneath cultural differences, human consciousness works similarly. Stream of consciousness techniques reveal this universal structure. The fragmentation of modern life is experienced by everyone in industrialized societies, regardless of particular identity. Modernist innovations thus have transcultural validity. They are not just European or bourgeois, but human. Particularist interpretations argue that what modernists presented as universal was actually specific to particular class, race, gender, and cultural positions. Stream of consciousness, as practiced by Woolf or Joyce, reflects educated bourgeois interiority, not universal consciousness. The experience of fragmentation differs radically depending on one's social position. Workers experience alienation differently than bohemian artists. Women experience modernity differently than men. Colonized peoples experience modernity differently than colonizers. Modernist universalism erased these differences, falsely generalizing from particular elite experiences. These scholarly battles show that modernism remains contested territory. Even basic questions about what it is, when it happened, what it means, and how it should be evaluated remain unresolved. This persistent controversy is itself significant. It suggests that modernism touched on fundamental questions about art, consciousness, society, and meaning that admit of no easy answers. The debates continue because the problems modernism addressed remain with us, even if modernism's particular responses now seem inadequate. Part 8. The Legacy and Reckoning. More than half a century after modernism's supposed end, we can attempt a reckoning. What survived of this revolutionary movement? What died? What continues to shape how we think, create, and understand ourselves? And what should contemporary culture take from modernism? What should it leave behind? These questions have no definitive answers, but wrestling with them illuminates both modernism and our current situation. The most obvious legacy is formal and technical. Modernist innovations in representing consciousness, time, and perception have become standard tools that writers, filmmakers, and artists use without necessarily thinking of themselves as modernist. Stream of consciousness, fragmented chronology, unreliable narration, multiple perspectives. These techniques are now part of the common repertoire. They no longer shock or disorient as they once did. They have been absorbed, domesticated, made familiar. This absorption is both success and failure. Success because modernist innovations proved durable enough to be incorporated into ongoing practice. They were not merely momentary provocations, but genuine expansions of expressive possibility. Failure because the absorption often means the loss of the technique's original critical force. Stream of consciousness as a technique for selling soft drinks in television commercials is not what Joyce intended. The use of fragmentation as a stylish mannerism in Hollywood films evacuates its original meaning. Nevertheless, serious contemporary artists continue to use modernist techniques in ways that extend and develop them. Novelists like Virginia Woolf and James Joyce establish possibilities for representing consciousness that later writers could not simply ignore. Even writers who reject modernist techniques do so from a position after modernism, aware of the possibilities they are choosing not to pursue. Modernism changed what is available to writers, what options exist, what problems must be confronted. The philosophical legacy is more ambiguous. Modernism's critique of naive realism, its exposure of consciousness as fragmentary and opaque, its challenge to Enlightenment rationalism, these insights have been absorbed into general intellectual culture. We can no longer innocently believe that consciousness is transparent to itself, that objective representation is straightforward, that reason alone can guide human action. Post-Freud, post-Nietzsche, post-Bergson, we understand these matters more complexly. But modernism did not provide alternatives to what it demolished. The problem of meaning in a world without God or objective values remains unsolved. Modernism made us acutely aware of this problem but did not resolve it. Contemporary culture still struggles with questions of value, purpose and justification that modernism raised without answering. In this sense, we remain within the modernist problematic even if we are no longer practicing modernist art. The critique of totality and unified systems that modernism began has been radicalized by postmodernism and contemporary theory. The modernist suspicion of grand narratives, comprehensive explanations, and systematic thinking has become pervasive. We are now highly skeptical of claims to have total understanding or final answers. This skepticism is part of modernism's legacy, though contemporary expressions often go beyond what modernists themselves would have accepted. Modernism's engagement with non-Western cultures, however problematic, opened up awareness of cultural diversity that has continued to expand. The recognition that Western culture is not the only legitimate form of civilization, that other traditions offer valuable perspectives and achievements, was advanced by modernist openness to non-Western art and thought. Subsequent post-colonial critique has shown how inadequate and appropriative modernist engagement often was, but the opening had consequences that exceeded modernist intentions. The institutional legacy is significant. Universities became the primary preservers and transmitters of modernist culture. Literary modernism, in particular, achieved canonical status, studied in schools worldwide. This institutionalization ensured modernism's survival, but also transformed it. Works that had been revolutionary provocations became required reading. Techniques that had shocked became examination topics. The absorption into academic culture neutralized much of modernism's critical edge while preserving its formal achievements. The new criticism, the dominant approach to literary study in the mid-20th century, was deeply influenced by modernist aesthetics. Its emphasis on close reading, formal analysis, textual autonomy, and organic unity reflected modernist values. This approach trained multiple generations of readers in sophisticated textual interpretation. It also reinforced modernist separation of art from social context, treating works as self-contained aesthetic objects rather than products of particular historical conditions. Later, critical approaches from Marxist to feminist to post-colonial criticism challenged new critical methods, while building on the close attention to texts that new criticism developed. The dialectic between formalist and contextual approaches continues to structure literary studies. This is part of modernism's ongoing legacy in academic culture. In visual arts, modernist movements established the basic vocabulary that contemporary art still uses. Abstraction, conceptualism, performance, installation all have roots in modernist innovations. The idea that art need not represent external reality, that it can explore pure form or concept or process, this is modernism's gift to contemporary practice. Even figural art made after modernism is different, inflected by the knowledge that representation is a choice rather than necessity. But the contemporary art world has also moved beyond modernism in significant ways. The modernist faith in progress through formal innovation has largely been abandoned. The idea that each generation must advance beyond the previous through more radical experimentation no longer compels. Contemporary artists freely mix styles, appropriate from any period, combine high and low without anxiety. This eclectic freedom is both liberation from modernist imperatives and loss of modernist seriousness. In architecture, modernism's legacy is physically unavoidable. The built environment of the late 20th and early 21st centuries is largely modernist, from office towers to housing projects to institutional buildings. The modernist imperative that form follows function, the use of new materials like steel and glass, the rejection of ornament, all these continue to shape how buildings are designed and constructed. Yet architectural modernism's failures are also painfully visible. Brutalist concrete housing blocks, sterile corporate plazas, inhuman urban planning, these demonstrate what happens when functional rationality is pursued without adequate attention to human needs for beauty, scale, tradition, and place. Postmodern architecture's return to ornament, historical reference, and playfulness was partly a reaction against modernist austerity. Contemporary architecture attempts to incorporate modernist technical achievements while recovering what modernism rejected. Connection to place, human scale, aesthetic richness. The cultural legacy involves changed expectations about what art is and does. The idea that serious art should be challenging, that it should require effort and thought, that it should disturb rather than merely please, These are modernist assumptions that persist even when modernist techniques are not used. The opposite idea, that art should be accessible, entertaining, and immediately gratifying, is often presented as populist resistance to modernist elitism. This debate structures contemporary cultural discourse. The problem is that both positions are inadequate. Art that is merely difficult without justification is indeed elitist and exclusionary. But art that is merely easy often panders rather than challenges, reinforcing rather than questioning assumptions. The task is creating art that is simultaneously accessible and serious, that communicates widely while maintaining complexity and depth. Some contemporary work achieves this synthesis. Much does not. Modernism's critique of mass culture remains relevant even as mass culture has changed. The digital age has created new forms of cultural production and consumption that share some features with the mass culture modernists despised. Standardization, commercial manipulation, passive consumption, superficiality. But digital culture also enables new forms of participation, creativity and connection that complicate simple high and low distinctions. The modernist framework seems inadequate to contemporary conditions, even if some of its concerns remain valid. The psychological legacy involves changed self-understanding. We now take for granted that consciousness is complex, that unconscious processes shape thought and behavior, that memory is reconstructive rather than reproductive, that the self is not a simple unity but a multiplicity. These insights, which modernism helped articulate and disseminate, have become common sense. We understand ourselves as more complicated, contradictory and mysterious than our pre-modernist ancestors did. But this changed self-understanding has costs as well as benefits. The loss of belief in a stable, unified self can lead to psychological fragmentation and inability to take responsibility for actions. The awareness of unconscious motivation can produce endless self-analysis without resolution. The recognition that identity is constructed can undermine the capacity for commitment and authentic selfhood. Modernism revealed complexities that we cannot unknow, but we are still learning how to live with these revelations. What should contemporary culture take from modernism? First, intellectual honesty. Modernism faced uncomfortable truths about consciousness, society, and meaning rather than clinging to comforting illusions. This honesty is a permanent value. Second, formal ambition. Modernism demonstrated that expanding expressive possibilities requires experimentation and risk. Art that merely repeats familiar forms cannot reveal new aspects of reality or consciousness. Third, seriousness about meaning. Modernism took questions of value, purpose, and significance as central concerns. Contemporary culture, saturated with irony and distraction, needs to recover this seriousness. Fourth, the recognition that form and content are inseparable. How you say something is part of what you say. The modernist understanding that conventional forms carry conventional assumptions, that genuinely new content requires new forms, remains valid. Fifth, the commitment to difficulty when necessary. Not all complexity is justified, but some complexity is unavoidable if you are engaging seriously with difficult subjects. Easy answers to hard questions are usually false answers. What should contemporary culture leave behind? First, elitism. The modernist contempt for ordinary people and popular culture was both morally wrong and strategically foolish. Culture that speaks only to small educated audiences has limited social impact and becomes self-enclosed. Second, political naivety. The idea that art can remain purely autonomous, disconnected from political and social conditions, is untenable. So is the idea that aesthetic excellence justifies political reaction. Art is always already political, and artists must take responsibility for the politics their work implies or enables. Third, Eurocentrism. The assumption that European perspectives are universal must be rejected. Genuinely global culture requires genuine engagement with diverse traditions as equals. Fourth, the rigid distinction between high and low culture. This distinction served to maintain class hierarchies more than to preserve genuine aesthetic value. Many popular forms contain sophistication and seriousness, while much high culture is pretentious and empty. Fifth, the cult of difficulty for its own sake. Obscurity is not automatically depth, and accessibility is not automatically superficiality. The ultimate reckoning with modernism requires recognizing both its achievements and its limitations. It was a necessary movement that expanded artistic possibilities and deepened understanding of consciousness and modernity. Its technical innovations are permanent achievements. Its philosophical insights cannot be ignored, but it was also limited by its historical moment, compromised by its social position, blind to its own assumptions, unable to resolve the problems it diagnosed. We cannot return to pre-modernist innocence. The questions modernism raised about representation, consciousness, meaning and value cannot be unasked. But neither can we simply continue modernist practices as if their limitations were not now visible. The task is to move beyond modernism while incorporating its genuine achievements, to develop forms and practices that are simultaneously complex and accessible, formally innovative and socially engaged, intellectually serious and humanly generous. This requires rejecting the either-or logic that structured much modernist thought. Not either difficulty or accessibility, but difficulty when necessary and accessibility where possible. Not either aesthetic autonomy or political commitment, but recognition that aesthetic and political concerns interpenetrate. Not either individual consciousness or social structure, but understanding how they mutually constitute each other. Not either Western tradition or non-Western perspectives, but genuine cultural dialogue among equals. Modernism was a moment when Western culture confronted the collapse of its foundational assumptions and attempted to create new forms, adequate to radically changed conditions. It achieved partial success at enormous cost. The collapse of certainty that modernism diagnosed has only intensified. The technological and social changes that produced modernism have accelerated beyond anything early 20th century artists could have imagined. The fragmentation, alienation, and crisis of meaning that modernism articulated remain our problems. But we face these problems with a century of experience that modernists lacked. We can see where their approaches succeeded and where they failed. We can learn from their achievements without repeating their mistakes. We can honor their intellectual courage while rejecting their elitism, admire their formal innovations while questioning their political blindness, appreciate their depth while seeking greater accessibility. This is the legacy and reckoning with modernism. Neither wholesale rejection nor uncritical celebration, but discriminating engagement that takes what remains valuable while leaving behind what does not. The deepest lesson may be that there are no final solutions to the problems of meaning, value, and representation that modernism confronted. Each generation must engage with these questions anew in its own historical circumstances, with its own resources and limitations. Modernism was one generation's engagement. It produced remarkable achievements and instructive failures. Now the task passes to us. We inherit both the problems and the partial solutions. What we make of this inheritance will define our own relationship to modernity and to the human need for meaning in a world that does not provide it automatically.